In this video, we will talk about a statement made by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who said that if Europe and the United States guarantee security, he is ready to hold presidential elections in the country within 60 days. Abraham Lincoln in 1864 insisted on holding presidential elections at the height of the American Civil War, arguing that suspending the vote would be admitting that democracy could not survive a war. It was a bold act that reaffirmed American democracy during one of the most terrible moments in its history. Today, more than a century and a half later, another country is at war, and it is also facing the same election dilemma, with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky under increasing pressure to hold presidential elections amid daily Russian airstrikes. And it was because of all this pressure that on Wednesday, December 10th, Zelensky declared that Ukraine may be ready to go to the polls within weeks, marking a complete break from the rhetoric of the past 3.5 years. During this period, the Ukrainian president has always stated that holding general elections would not only be unconstitutional, but also a serious security risk. That is why Kiev's official stance has always been clear: elections only after the end of the war. But then, why this change now? The answer has a first and last name: Donald Trump. The American president went public in an interview with the politician and didn't mince words, saying it was time to hold an election in Ukraine with Trump. He also said that Zelensky talks about democracy, but that without elections, there comes a point when it's no longer a democracy. The purpose of this statement is clear, with the American president tying the legitimacy of Zelensky's government to the holding of the election. And Zelensky, a strategist by nature, he understood the message, but he imposed a vital condition, almost an escape clause, saying that the election will take place if, and only if, the United States and European partners guarantee the security of the process. A concern that, in fact, makes perfect sense, given the daily airstrikes that Russia carries out against Ukrainian cities. That's why concentrating thousands of people in long lines at polling stations spread across a country at war is clearly an extreme security risk for civilians. But beyond the obvious security issue, there is also a major legal knot. Zelensky's presidential term officially expired in 2024. However, the Constitution of Ukraine, specifically in Article 83, automatically extends the powers of parliament under martial law, and although the Constitution is less explicit about the presidency, the law on the legal regime of martial law in Article 19 expressly prohibits elections, whether presidential, parliamentary, or local, during a war. Zelensky has already asked lawmakers to prepare proposals to get around this. But changing the electoral law during martial law is a legal minefield that Moscow will exploit to the fullest. And then there's also the challenge of physical logistics, since we're talking about millions of internally displaced people and refugees scattered across Europe and the rest of the world. How can you ensure the vote of millions of people spread out in so many places? The most logical solution would be to set up polling stations in Ukrainian consulates abroad. But there aren't that many Ukrainian consulates in the world, and in many countries, like the United States, where there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, the consulates capable of receiving votes are located in San Francisco, New York, and Chicago. This would force large numbers of war refugees to travel long distances, and for obvious reasons, they don't have many financial resources available for such trips. And even in Europe, where there are millions of Ukrainian refugees, consulates are usually located only in the capitals, which would also require significant internal travel to vote. And there's an even more problematic segment of the population when it comes to voting. I'm referring to the soldiers. How can votes be collected on the front lines in Donbass or Zaporizhia without exposing troop concentrations to a Russian artillery attack? One alternative would be to transport the ballot boxes in armored vehicles escorted along the front line. But the logistical effort for that would be enormous. And on top of all that, there's also the opinion of the Ukrainian people, with 63% of the population believing that elections should only take place after the end of the war, and with only 22% supporting the idea of voting under a ceasefire, with a small minority supporting holding elections now in the midst of the war. The reason for this is simple. The Ukrainian population understands the risks, and they know that Russia would not hesitate to launch drones and missiles at polling stations full of civilians. But let's suppose that the issues of logistics, costs, and especially security are resolved. Who would win these elections? According to the most recent polls, Zelensky would win, but by a very narrow margin, with only 20.3% of the votes. Just over 1% ahead of Valerii Zaluzhny, former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces and seen as a great war hero by the population. Zaluzhny was dismissed by Zelensky after disagreements over mobilization strategy and the stalemate at the front. But he did not fall from grace, nor was he sidelined, instead receiving in exchange for his services the important post of ambassador to the United Kingdom. He is now acting on a political level to ensure the continued British support for Ukraine's defensive effort. Zaluzhny represents pure military competence, untainted by the wear and tear of daily politics. And he is highly respected by a large portion of the Ukrainian military circle. That's why if Zelensky opens the polls, he might actually be handing the presidency to the very man he dismissed. For Moscow, which, as we know, is also pressuring Ukraine to hold elections in an attempt to get rid of Zelensky, this move could backfire, because if Zelensky wins, his legitimacy will obviously be greatly strengthened. But even if he loses, Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian war hero with an even more aggressive view of the conflict than Zelensky, would take over the presidency, promising to continue exerting strong pressure against the Russian invasion effort. There would still be a third candidate, Kirill Budanov, the head of Ukrainian intelligence and the person responsible for major attacks against Russia. But he would be a backup option, remaining, according to the polls, in a distant third place with 5% of the votes. But it serves to show that it doesn't matter. The candidate, the next Ukrainian president, will remain fully committed to defending the country against the Russian invasion. But in short, Zelensky has made everything conditional on security. And if Trump wants, even if there are elections in Ukraine, then the United States will have to provide direct support to guarantee security. Otherwise, millions of Ukrainians will become easy targets for Russian drones and missiles at polling stations spread throughout the country.